The notice was yellow. I remember that before I remember anything else. A sheet of paper the color of goldenrod, stapled crooked through the porch post. My own hands had set 40 years before, flapping a little in a wind that smelled like rain coming off the ridge. County Seal of West Virginia. Notice of seizure and pending foreclosure. My name typed clean at the top, like it belonged there. Like 60 years of being a Hatfield on this land had never happened at all. I stood on my own porch, like a man who'd wandered onto somebody else's property, reading words I understood and didn't believe. And somewhere behind me, I could hear Carol, not crying. That's the part I want you to understand first, not the paper, the quiet. 41 years married to a woman who cried at dog food commercials. And on the worst morning of our life together, she didn't make a sound. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and that's not how I was raised to tell a story. My granddaddy used to say, a man who starts at the collapse never tells you why the building was worth grieving. So let me take you back, not to that morning, to the life before it. Because the truest thing I can tell you about ruin is that it never announces itself. It comes wearing the same face as every good day you've ever had. I was 60 years old that spring, and most mornings I woke before Carol, before the birds even, and walked out to stand on the ridge my great-grandfather cleared with a mule and a wedge, and more stubbornness than sense. 3 generations of Hatfields had worked that stone, split it, hauled it, built half the foundations and chimneys and church steps in Hollis Creek out of it. Hatfield Stone, the business was called, though it had never been much of a business in the way the world counts business. It was a way of taking something hard and hidden under the dirt and turning it into something that held a house up for 100 years. That morning the fog was still sitting low in the hollow, the way it does in West Virginia in April, like the mountain hadn't quite decided to wake up either. I could hear Cold Hollow Creek running high with snowmelt down past the lower field, and somewhere behind me, through the kitchen window, Carol humming something I couldn't name. The coffee pot ticking, the way it always did right before it finished. My boy's truck sat in the yard, Eli's, who'd come back from 2 tours with the guard, quieter than he left, and Wade's, who'd come back from college with more opinions than quiet ever held. Both of them still lived close enough to walk to the quarry most mornings, which was its own kind of miracle, in a county that had been bleeding young people for 30 years. Carol would come out onto the porch around then, 2 mugs in her hands, and stand next to me without saying much of anything. Because after 41 years of marriage, we'd learned that some mornings don't need filling with words. She still looked at that ridge the way she had the first time I brought her up there, courting her, like it surprised her every single time. Like beauty was something that could still catch her off guard at 58. I used to think that was the rarest thing about her. Now I think it was the truest thing about both of us, that we never stopped being grateful for ground that wasn't ours to keep, only ours to tend. I used to think a morning like that was something you earned. Work hard, keep your word, take care of your own, and the mountain takes care of you back. I believed that the way some men believe in Scripture, not because anybody proved it to me, but because I'd never once seen it fail. Bedrock doesn't ask to be trusted, it just holds. That's what I thought Lou Brandt was, if I'm honest. Bedrock. Lou and I had been friends since we were 9 years old, skipping stones on that same creek, before either of us had a hair on our chin. I could still see it, clear as anything. The 2 of us soaked to the knees, arguing over who'd won, until his daddy hollered both our names up the hollow for supper. 40 years of friendship, and not one piece of paper between us in all that time. Not a loan agreement, not a contract, not so much as an IOU scratched on a napkin. A man's word was supposed to be load-bearing in this county. Lou's word had held up everything I'd ever asked it to. He'd stood up at my wedding. He'd helped me bury my daddy, carried the casket on the same shoulder as Eli, When the quarry equipment broke down 2 winters running and I didn't have the cash to fix it, Lou put the money in my hand and told me to pay him back whenever. Like the date didn't matter. Like our friendship was the only collateral either of us would ever need. So when his truck came up the gravel that morning, dust rising gold in the early light, I didn't think twice about waving him up onto the porch. He had a folder under his arm and a smile on his face I'd seen 1,000 times. The smile of a man who's about to do you a favor. "Roy," he said, setting that folder down on the porch rail between us, right next to the coffee Carol had just brought out. "I think I've finally found the thing that saves this whole town, and I want you in it first." I didn't know yet that I was looking at the last ordinary morning I would ever have. I didn't know that the hand I was about to shake would within the year take everything my family had built and leave us standing on a porch reading our own name on a county seizure notice. I just smiled back and I shook it. It was, I would come to understand, the most expensive handshake of my life. We didn't stay on the porch. Lou said a conversation like this one deserved a table, so I led him into the kitchen past Carol, who topped off both our coffees and then stayed standing by the counter, instead of going back to her garden the way she normally would have. I noticed it. I just didn't understand yet why it mattered. Lou spread 3 sheets of paper across the table, smoothing each one flat with the side of his hand, like a man laying out a quilt. Maps, mostly. The old strip mine bench above the county line, all scarred earth and dead timber redrawn in his renderings, as rows of solar panels catching the morning light. Blue Mountain Renewable Partners, the header read, and underneath it, smaller, reclamation, remediation, renewal. "Coal left this county for dead, Roy," he said, tapping the map with one finger. 40 years we've watched our young people leave because there's nothing here to stay for. This is the thing that brings them back. Clean energy, good union jobs, and we heal the ground while we're at it. Not somebody else's company coming in to strip us again. Ours. Built by us, for us. He wasn't wrong about the dying part, and that was what made it land so hard. The high school had closed 2 grades down to 1 building the year before. The Methodist church ran 1 Sunday service now, instead of 2 thinner than I remembered from boyhood. Half the storefronts on Main Street wore plywood instead of glass. I want you to understand how that sounded to a man like me. I had spent my whole life turning hard, broken ground into something useful that was the family trade going back 3 generations. Lou wasn't selling me solar panels. He was selling me the one thing I'd always believed in without ever needing proof, that this place and the people in it were worth saving. He told me about his partner out of state, a man named Garrett Vance, who ran an operation called Meridian Resource Partners, and had done this kind of reclamation work all through Kentucky and Pennsylvania. Serious money, Lou said, real experience. All Vance needed was local credibility, a trusted name to put in front of the bank and the neighbors. A face on the project that wasn't a stranger's. "I want that name to be yours," Lou said. "Managing member. Your signature makes this a hometown project instead of an outside company doing whatever it wants to our hills. Folks trust you, Roy. They always have. I should tell you, because it matters, that some part of me sitting at that table felt something close to pride. 40 years of friendship, and Lou was handing me the one role in this whole venture that mattered. Not the money man, not the silent investor, but the name people would look to. I didn't think of it as risk. I thought of it as being asked to be load-bearing again, the way I'd been my whole working life. The numbers were real money. What savings we had, plus a stake in the ridge itself, put up as collateral against my share. The upper acreage that wasn't doing anything but growing scrub pine anyway. The permits and the county approvals were Lou's department. He said he'd sat on enough boards and shaken enough hands in Charleston over the years to know exactly which doors needed knocking on and in what order. Lou walked me through the rest, slow and patient. The way you'd walk a nervous customer through a quote. An answer, ready for every question. Easy as breathing. Carol asked the only question that night that I didn't have a ready answer for. We were getting ready for bed, and she was brushing out her hair in the mirror, watching me in the reflection instead of turning around. "Where does all his money come from, Roy?" she said, quiet, like she was asking about the weather. I grew up 2 roads over from the Brants. They never had 2 nickels to rub together. Now Lou's got a new truck every other year, and a man like this Vance fellow calling him partner. "Maybe he's just smarter than the rest of us," I said, half a joke, and climbed into bed without giving it another thought. She didn't say anything else, but I remember she was quiet a long while before she turned off the lamp, and I remember thinking it was a strange thing for a man's own wife to half-doubt the one friend who'd never once let him down. I told the boys over Sunday dinner the following week, laying it out the way Lou had laid it out for me. The jobs, the reclaimed land, our family's name on something that might actually hold this county together a while longer. Wade had questions, the way Wade always had questions, about who was financing it and what the timeline looked like. I waved most of it off as details Lou would handle. Eli didn't say much of anything, just nodded along and asked to see the maps, studying them longer than the conversation around him seemed to require. I took his quiet for the same quiet he'd carried home from overseas. I didn't think not once that it might be the start of him watching something the rest of us weren't watching yet. I signed the papers 2 weeks later in Lou's office above the hardware store, his secretary witnessing his lawyer's stamp already pressed into the corner of every page, like the decision had been made before I ever walked in. There were more pages than I expected. Operating agreements, collateral assignments, environmental compliance clauses, written in language so dense I skimmed it like a sermon I'd heard 100 times before. Lou kept a hand on my shoulder the whole time, telling me where to initial, telling me I was doing right by this county. Managing member, Blue Mountain Renewable Partners, LLC, Roy E. Hatfield. The pin was just a pin. Black plastic, a bank's promotional giveaway, the logo half worn off the barrel. But I remember it felt heavier in my hand than it had any right to be. Like it already knew something I didn't. 6 months into the project, I walked down to check the lower spring the way I had most mornings of my life, and the water wasn't right. Cold Hollow Creek had always run clear enough to see your own boot soles through it. That morning, it carried a rust-colored sheen along the edges, and when I crouched to touch it, there was a smell underneath the cold. Faint metallic wrong in a way I couldn't put a name to. I didn't see a single minnow in the shallows where they always schooled this time of year. I called Lou before I'd even finished my coffee. He laughed it off, easy as he laughed off everything. Grading equipment runoff, he said nothing more than dirt and machine oil stirred up from clearing the bench above us. And he'd have the environmental fellow test it that week, just to put my mind at ease. I believed him because believing him had never once cost me anything before. And because the alternative, that something was actually wrong, wasn't a thought I had room for yet. That was the first hairline fracture. In my trade, you learn to watch for those. A crack too thin to worry a man who's never split stone. But a man who has knows a hairline today is a slab in 2 pieces by next spring if you don't pay it mind. I didn't pay it mind. Not at first. The second crack came from Carol. She kept the books for Hatfield Stone the way she'd kept them for 30 years, and somewhere in that same stretch, she'd started keeping half an eye on the LLC paperwork too. Because somebody in this family ought to, she said. The disbursements didn't square with the invoices Lou forwarded. Money was moving out of the project accounts faster than equipment was showing up on the bench. And when she asked Lou for a clearer accounting, he told her not to trouble herself with numbers that complicated, that he'd walk me through it personally sometime soon. Sometime soon never quite arrived. The third crack was Eli. And Eli's cracks were the kind you couldn't talk your way around. He'd taken up running again that spring, up before light most mornings, the way the guard had trained into him and never quite trained back out. And his route took him past the gravel turnoff to the bench road. He came in from one of those runs in May, still breathing hard, and told me he'd passed trucks heading up that road at 4 in the morning. Not the flatbeds and excavators you'd expect hauling panel frames, but tankers, unmarked, moving slow with their headlights off until they cleared the county road. He said there was a man up there most nights now, heavy-set. Didn't wave back when Eli lifted a hand. Just watched him run past, with a kind of stillness that wasn't friendly. "Solar panels don't need tankers, Dad," Eli said. "And nobody hauling something legal kills their headlights." I told him construction sites ran strange hours sometimes. I told him Lou had explained the runoff, and he'd explain the trucks too if I just asked him plain. I believed every word I was saying when I said it, which is its own kind of foolishness. The kind a man doesn't recognize in himself until somebody he loves is standing in his kitchen, looking at him like he's failed a test he didn't know he was taking. "You always taught us a wall doesn't fall down all at once," Eli said. "It cracks first. Quiet. Somewhere nobody's looking." I didn't have an answer for that, because it was my own line thrown back at me. Words I'd said to both my boys 100 times, standing over a half-built foundation. I went to see Lou that same week and asked him straight about the trucks. He didn't flinch. Lou never flinched. That was the whole trouble with him. He just told me Vance's crew sometimes used overnight deliveries to dodge daytime traffic on the county road. A courtesy to the neighbors. Nothing more sinister than that. He clapped my shoulder on his way back to his truck and told me I worried too much for a man about to be part of the biggest thing this county had seen in 40 years. I wanted to believe him so badly that I let myself. Carol didn't push it after that. Not out loud. Though I noticed she started keeping her own folder of copies, invoices, bank statements, anything with the project's name on it, tucked behind the recipe box where I never thought to look. Wade found his own crack a different way. The way Wade found everything, sitting at a laptop instead of standing in a field. He looked up Meridian Resource Partners one evening after supper and came back with almost nothing. A thin website, no staff names, a corporate address in Wilmington that turned out, once he dug a layer deeper, to belong to a building registered to hundreds of companies at once. "That's not an office, Dad," he said, turning the screen toward me. "That's a mailbox." I told him plenty of legitimate outfits incorporated that way for the tax advantage, which was true enough, and true enough was all I needed that summer to set the thought back down. I noticed Eli stopped running past the bench road and started driving past it instead, slower, his truck windows down, even in the cold. It was Eli who came to find me on a Saturday near the end of June, dust still on his boots from the quarry. His jaw set in a way I recognized from the day he shipped out the second time. "Dad," he said, "you need to come see what's crawling onto our land at night." We never made it up to the bench road that Saturday. Eli was still lacing his boots on the porch steps, and I was reaching for my truck keys when a car none of us recognized came up the gravel. Too fast for a friendly visit. County insignia on the door, and a deputy I'd known since he was a boy in my Sunday school class got out holding a folder he wouldn't quite look at me over. "Mr. Hatfield," he said, "I've got papers I'm obligated to serve you." I want to tell you I had some instinct right then, some cold drop in my stomach that told me my whole life was about to come apart in the next 20 minutes. I didn't. I thought it was a mistake. I thought it all the way through the first page and the second, and somewhere around the third, I stopped being able to think anything at all. The bank had called the note due in full, citing default on Blue Mountain Renewable Partners, LLC, and irregularities in the loan's underlying collateral. Our ridge, the upper acreage I'd signed over, without ever imagining I'd hear that word irregularities attached to my own family's land. Behind that was a notice from the State Department of Environmental Protection citing unpermitted hazardous discharge at the reclamation site, every page of it referencing permits filed under my name as managing member of record. Behind that was a letter informing me that the LLC's operating accounts, including the funds Carol and I had put in ourselves, were frozen, pending a state inquiry into the project's finances. 3 pieces of paper, and every single one of them ended at my name. Wade took the papers out of my hands before I'd even finished the first read-through, scanning faster than the rest of us ever could, the way he'd always read everything faster. "Dad, this isn't just the company," he said, his voice gone flat in a way I'd never heard from him before. "Managing member of record. They're saying this is on you personally, not Blue Mountain. You." Eli didn't say a word. He just looked toward the gravel where Lou's truck usually sat when he visited, his jaw working slow. And I understood without him saying it that he was thinking about a Saturday morning we'd never gotten the chance to finish. I called Lou standing right there in the yard, the deputy still waiting on some signature I don't remember giving him. Straight to voicemail. I called again 10 minutes later, driving too fast down our own road, and got a recording telling me the number was no longer in service. Like Lou Brandt had never existed at all. Like 40 years of friendship could be switched off the same way you'd cancel a phone plan. His office above the hardware store was dark when I got there. The blinds drawn, a stack of mail already collecting under the door slot, like nobody had touched it in days. Don Pruitt, who ran the hardware store downstairs, told me Lou hadn't been in since Wednesday, and that 2 other men in suits had come by Thursday, asking the same question I was asking, and gotten the same nothing I was getting. Word travels fast in a county this size, faster than I could outrun it even trying. By the time I made it to the gas station for fuel I didn't actually need, just an excuse to be somewhere besides my own driveway, Carl Anders cornered me by the pumps, half out of his mind, asking what was happening to the $11,000 he'd put into Blue Mountain, on my say-so, on Lou's say-so, on the strength of 2 names he'd trusted his whole life. I didn't have an answer for Carl. I didn't have an answer for myself. Carol was waiting on the porch when I finally drove back up our hill, and one look at her face told me the deputy had already come and gone a second time while I was out chasing ghosts in town. She wasn't crying. I want you to understand that about her, because it tells you more than tears ever could have. 41 years, married to a woman who'd cried at dog food commercials, and on the worst afternoon of our life together, she stood there, dry-eyed and still as the ridge behind her, watching me climb those porch steps like she already understood something I hadn't caught up to yet. The notice was stapled to the post by the front door. The post my own hands had set when we built that porch, the summer after we married. Goldenrod paper, county seal pressed dark into one corner. Notice of seizure and pending foreclosure. My name typed clean across the top, like 60 years of being a Hatfield on that land had never happened at all. I was still reading it, my hand flat against the post, like the wood itself might hold me up, when I caught movement on the county road below us. A truck I'd know anywhere, slowing just enough at the bottom of our drive that I knew he saw us standing there. He didn't turn in. He didn't roll down his window. Lou's truck just kept rolling on past, taillights shrinking into the evening like a man with somewhere else he needed to be, and somewhere else he needed me not to ask him about. I stood on my own porch and watched my oldest friend disappear down the road. And I understood in some wordless, animal way that hadn't caught up to language yet, that the man I'd shaken hands with a year before had already left long before that truck ever came into view. The truck we rented to move what the bank let us keep was too big for what we actually owned anymore, and somehow still not big enough for what we were leaving behind. Carol packed my granddaddy's stone chisels in a towel like they were china. Eli carried the porch swing out to the truck bed alone, refusing help from anybody, the muscles in his jaw doing more talking than his mouth ever would. I stood in the empty kitchen for a long minute before I left it, running my hand along the counter Carol and I had picked out together 30 years before. And then I made myself walk out the door without looking back. Because I knew if I looked back, I wasn't going to make it down the steps. I looked back anyway once from the end of the drive. The ridge sat up there exactly the way it always had, indifferent to who held the deed to it. And I understood for the first time in my life that the land had never belonged to us at all. We had only ever belonged to it. In the cab of that rented truck, crammed in beside Carol, with the boys following behind in Eli's pickup, nobody said a single word for the first 3 miles. And I don't think any of us could have managed one without it cracking wide open into something worse. The rental was a duplex on the flat part of town, near the rail spur, thin-walled enough that we could hear the Pattersons next door arguing about their cable bill through what passed for insulation. 2 bedrooms for 4 grown people, boxes stacked to the ceiling in the hallway because there was nowhere else to put them. The smell of somebody else's cooking seeping in under a door that didn't sit quite right in its frame. I'd spent 60 years building things that held. I lay awake that first night, listening to a refrigerator hum on the other side of a wall I could have put my fist through. And I understood exactly how little I'd managed to hold on to. Word travels the way it always travels in a place this size. Not unkindly, most of it, but constant. And constant was its own kind of cruelty. The woman at the grocery checkout who used to ask after my mother got quiet and busy with her register when I came through the line. A man I'd sold stone to for 15 years crossed the parking lot rather than walk past me. I understood it. Half this county had a cousin or a neighbor who'd put money into Blue Mountain on the strength of my name standing next to Lou's. And my name was the only one still standing, anywhere they could find it. I didn't blame them. I just hadn't known how heavy a town's disappointment could sit on a man's shoulders, until I felt the whole weight of it walking down Main Street. Not everybody turned away. Old Mrs. Kessler from church caught my arm outside the post office and told me she'd known Hatfields her whole life and wasn't about to start doubting one over a man like Lou Brandt. And I had to sit in my truck afterward for a good 5 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. I blamed myself plenty enough to make up for whatever they weren't saying out loud. I ran the whole thing over at night. Every conversation with Lou replayed a dozen different ways, searching for the moment I should have known better, the moment a smarter man would have pulled his hand back instead of shaking on it. I couldn't find that moment. That was its own kind of torment, not being able to point to the exact place I'd failed my family, just knowing in some general and crushing way that I had. Eli and Wade started snapping at each other over nothing. Whose turn it was for the shower, who'd left a box blocking the hallway. The way brothers do when the real thing they're angry about is too big to put a name to. I snapped at Carol once over something so small I can't even tell you now what it was. And the look on her face afterward, more hurt than angry, sat with me worse than anything the deputy's papers had said. That was the bottom. Not the truck, not the duplex, not the woman at the register. It was lying in a bed too narrow for 2 people who'd shared a bigger one for 41 years, listening to my wife breathe beside me and not knowing how to ask her forgiveness for a debt I couldn't even fully name. I kept thinking about my granddaddy and his granddaddy before him, and how neither one of them had ever once had to explain to his sons why the family land was gone. I was the first Hatfield in 3 generations to break something none of them had ever managed to break. And I didn't know yet whether that made me unlucky or just foolish. Carol wasn't asleep. I felt her get up sometime past midnight, careful the way you move when you don't want to wake somebody. I heard her in the front room a long while, And when I finally went looking for her, I found her kneeling on the floor with a section of baseboard pried loose and a metal lockbox sitting open on her knees. Papers spread around her in the lamplight like she'd done this kind of work before. "Carol," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I meant it to. "What is that?" She looked up at me, and there wasn't a single piece of surprise on her face, like she'd known this moment was coming long before I ever caught her at it. "I've been watching him for 2 years, Roy," she said. "I just needed you to be ready to believe me." I woke the boys myself, something I hadn't done since they were teenagers late for school, and the 4 of us sat down around that little rental kitchen table at 1 in the morning like it was the most natural hour in the world for a family meeting. Carol put on a pot of coffee none of us really needed, just for something to do with our hands, and the 4 of us sat there under one bare overhead bulb while she spread the contents of that lockbox out in front of us the way I'd seen her spread invoices for the stone business 1,000 times, organized into folders with tabs she must have labeled herself. I understood I was looking at 2 years of patient, deliberate work that I had walked past every single day without ever once suspecting it existed. She'd started simple, she told us. A new truck Lou hadn't needed. A camp on Summersville Lake he'd mentioned once and never again. A Tuesday 2 winters back when she'd spotted him having dinner at a steakhouse 2 counties over with men in suits who didn't look like anybody from Hollis Creek, on a night he'd told me he was visiting his sister in Beckley. A county commissioner's salary that didn't square by her arithmetic with the kind of money he seemed to be spending, none of it proof of anything on its own. A man can come into money plenty of honest ways, but Carol had kept a column for it anyway. The way she kept a column for everything, because something in her hadn't trusted the shape of it. Even before Lou ever brought us that folder full of solar panel renderings. "I didn't have enough to bring to you," she said, not quite looking at me. "Not enough to ask you to doubt your oldest friend over a hunch. So I just kept watching, and I kept it where you wouldn't trip over it." Eli's contribution was a spiral notebook, dates running down the margin, in his neat military hand. Every night he'd seen trucks on the bench road since March. Times makes, where he could tell a description of the heavy-set man who watched him run. Tucked behind the last page were 24 photographs he'd taken from his truck window with the headlights off, grainy and dark, but clear enough to make out tanker trucks where the project's own paperwork promised nothing but excavators and panel frames. "I didn't want to scare you with half a picture," he said. "I was trying to get the whole one first." Wade's piece of it lived entirely on a laptop, and it had grown considerably since the evening he'd shown me that thin website with no staff names on it. He'd kept pulling threads in the months since, quietly, the way he did most things. And what he'd found wasn't one shell company anymore. It was 3 stacked, one inside the next, like nesting dolls. Meridian Resource Partners, answering to a holding company in Delaware, that itself answered to something registered in a state that didn't require its owners' names be public at all. He'd found one filing, dated almost 2 years back, that listed an authorized signer whose name had been redacted in every public copy he could find. Somewhere at the bottom of that structure was a real person, controlling real money, and Wade hadn't found him yet. But he'd found enough to know the hiding was deliberate, layered on purpose by somebody who'd done this kind of thing before, and done it long before Lou ever shook my hand on the porch. I sat there at that table and felt 2 things at once, and I want you to understand they didn't cancel each other out. They just sat side by side, the way grief and gratitude sometimes will. I felt the sting of having been protected from my own family's worry for 2 years running, kept in the dark the way you'd keep a child from a thing too heavy for him to carry. And underneath that sting, plainer and stronger, I felt something close to awe at the 3 of them, my wife and my sons, quietly building a case in the margins of their own lives while I slept undisturbed down the hall. Because they loved me too much to let Lou Brandt be the only one watching me closely. Carol reached over and put her hand flat on top of mine on the table, and neither of us said anything about it, and neither of us needed to. "We don't have money," I said, because somebody needed to say the plain truth of where we stood. "We don't have a lawyer. Every account we had is frozen. I don't even know where you'd start with something like this." "You start with what's true," Carol said, "and you build from there. That's the only kind of foundation you ever taught these boys to trust anyway." It was Wade who found the last piece that night, going through a folder of documents Carol had pulled from the county recorder's office months before. Copies of every permit filed under Blue Mountain's name. He went quiet reading one of them, quieter than I'd heard him all night, and when he finally looked up, his face had gone the color of the legal pad in front of him. "Dad," he said, "these aren't just permits for the solar pads. Look at the scope language here. Surface alteration, subsurface fill, full reclamation rights across the entire parcel." He turned the page toward me, his finger under a signature line I recognized as my own. "This says you personally authorized fill and grading operations across the whole site. Not part of it. All of it." My hand was shaking by the time I set that permit down on the table. And I want to tell you it was shaking from anger, but that would be a lie. It was shaking because some part of me, slower than the rest, was only just then understanding what I'd actually signed. Full reclamation rights across the entire parcel. Subsurface fill. I had read those words the day Lou's lawyer pressed a pen into my hand, and heard nothing but legal wallpaper. Sitting at that kitchen table at 2 a.m, I heard something else entirely. "The reclamation was never the project," Carol said slowly, laying Eli's photographs out next to the permit like she was fitting stones into a wall. "It was the cover. Tankers in at night. Nothing legitimate ever coming back out. And a permit broad enough that nobody official would ever have grounds to ask what was actually going into that ground." Nobody said the word out loud yet. I think we all needed a little longer before we could. I drove up to the bench myself at first light, before the rest of the county was awake, with Eli riding silent beside me. Wade stayed back at the duplex to work a different angle, the one that lived on paper instead of dirt. I knew that land better than any man alive. I'd hunted it as a boy. Hauled stone off the lower face of it for 30 years. And I knew a deer trail along the ridge above the old mine pit that would put us looking down into the bench without ever setting a boot on Meridian's fenced acreage. We climbed it in the gray dark, the way my own granddaddy had taught me to move through timber, and we came out above the pit just as the sun was starting to find the bottom of it. I have buried family in this county. I have stood over open graves and felt the ground take something from me and give nothing back. I had never once in 60 years looked down at earth that frightened me the way that bench frightened me that morning. There were no solar panels. There was no reclamation crew, no seeded grass. None of the green renderings Lou had smoothed flat on my kitchen table a year before. There were stacked drums under tarps gone slick with rust-colored runoff, a low place in the old pit floor, standing full of water, with an oily sheen across the top of it that caught the morning light wrong, and a stand of timber along the lower edge, gone the gray-brown color of something that had stopped trying to live months ago. Eli didn't say anything for a long while. Neither did I. We just stood up there on that ridge and looked down at what our family's name had quietly given permission for. And I felt something in my chest that didn't have a clean word attached to it. Not just grief, not just rage, something closer to the feeling of watching a man you trusted put his hand around the throat of something you loved. "Dad," Eli finally said, "we need to test the water. Not just guess at it. Test it." We had a kit from the hardware store, the kind meant for backyard fish ponds. Cheap test strips that wouldn't hold up in any courtroom, but would at least tell us if our eyes were lying to us. They weren't. The strips came back wrong in 3 different spots along Cold Hollow Creek. Worse the closer we got to the bench. And Eli's jaw set the same way it had the morning he'd told me about the trucks. Except there was nothing left in his face now that looked like restraint. Wade was waiting on the porch step when we finally drove back down, laptop already open on his knees. He'd pulled the state's actual environmental authorization for the Blue Mountain site. The real one, filed separately from the county permits Lou had walked me through. It allowed grading. It allowed seeded restoration. It did not allow, anywhere in its language, the storage or disposal of industrial waste of any kind, hazardous or otherwise. "There's no version of this that's legal, Dad," he said, turning the screen toward me. "Not a loophole, not a gray area. Whatever's filling that pit up there, the state never approved a single drum of it." It was Carol who thought the call down to the Beasley place, 2 farms below ours, along the same creek where Otis Beasley had been running cattle on bottomland his family had worked even longer than ours. She came back from that phone call with her face gone pale in a way I hadn't seen since the day the deputy first came up our drive. Otis had lost 6 head of cattle in the last 2 months to something the county extension office couldn't explain. His well, the one his own grandkids drank from, had started tasting like a penny held too long on the tongue. I sat down hard on the porch step when Carol told us that because the floor of my own understanding had just dropped out from under me a second time in 1 week. This had never been only about my name on a piece of paper, or my family's land, or the $11,000 Carl Anders had lost on my say-so. There were wells and pastures and grandchildren 2 farms downstream from a thing I'd signed my name to without ever once reading it the way a careful man should have. Eli put his hand on my shoulder, the same hand that had carried our porch swing alone rather than ask for help. And for once, his voice didn't sound like a soldier giving a report. It sounded like my son. "This is bigger than us, Dad," he said. "It always was. We just didn't know it yet." The address Carol found us was 40 minutes south, down a gravel road that dead-ended at a farmhouse with a tin roof gone the soft orange of old rust, and a hand-lettered sign by the mailbox that just said, Voss. There was a workshop out back with its own separate generator, windows blacked out with what looked like the same kind of contractor paper we used to cover stone dust off a fresh-cut slab. And I remember thinking, walking up that gravel toward the porch, that this was a woman who'd built herself a life designed for nobody to look too closely into it. Carol had found her name buried in an old federal court filing, a case from 11 years back, where a company 2 shells removed from something called Highland Resource Group had been investigated for unpermitted discharge in a county 3 hours from here. A case that had simply stopped. No conviction, no settlement. Just silence in the docket. The lead investigator's name on every early filing was Eleanor Voss. Carol had spent a week tracking down where that name had gone after the silence started. Nell Voss opened her own door before we'd made it up the steps. 67 years old by my guess, built lean as fence wire, and she looked at the 2 of us standing on her porch for a long moment before she said a word. "You're the Hatfields," she said. It wasn't a question. "I read about the seizure in the Courier. Took you longer to find me than I expected, given what's sitting in that mine pit above your creek." She knew before we'd told her a single thing, and that told me more about what we were dealing with than any answer she could have given us in that first minute. She led us inside to a front room that didn't look like any retirement I'd ever pictured. File boxes stacked along one wall in neat labeled rows. A corkboard still pinned with photographs and handwritten timelines gone yellow at the edges. A framed EPA badge sitting face down on a shelf, like something she couldn't quite bring herself to throw away or look at straight on. She caught me noticing it and didn't bother explaining. Some rooms tell you everything a person's willing to say about themselves, without a single word. We sat at her kitchen table while Carol laid out what we had. Eli's photographs, Wade's corporate filings, the test strips, Otis Beasley's cattle. And Nell went through every page, slow and careful, the way I'd watch a stonemason run a hand along a wall before deciding whether it would hold weight. When she finally looked up, there wasn't a trace of surprise on her face, only something closer to recognition, like meeting an old enemy she'd been expecting to cross paths with again. "Highland Resource Group, Meridian Resource Partners," she said. "Different names, same architecture. Buy reclamation permits broad enough to cover anything. Attach a local face nobody would think to doubt. Move the waste through that face's good name and disappear before the bill comes due." I chased a version of this for 6 years before the agency pulled my funding and told me to call it inconclusive. "Why didn't anybody stop them?" I asked. "If you already knew the pattern." "Because knowing a pattern isn't evidence, Roy. A prosecutor needs intent. Not just that the waste went in the ground, anybody downstream of that pit can see that with their own eyes. They need proof that somebody planned it that way before the first shovel ever moved. That's the piece that always slips away from people like me. And it's the only piece that actually convicts people like them." She told us plain that we couldn't trust this to the county. Lou had sat on the commission 8 years. Men like Garrett Vance didn't choose partners who couldn't move permits quietly through people they already controlled. And we had no way yet of knowing how far that control reached past Lou himself. Our only real shot, she said, was building a chain of evidence clean enough to hand straight to federal investigators. EPA's criminal division, maybe the FBI, if the fraud crossed enough state lines, and bypassing every local office that might tip our hand to the wrong person before we were ready. "That's going to take time we don't have," Carol said. "And resources we don't have either. It's going to take exactly what you've already started doing," Nell said, nodding at the folder between us. "Patience and proof, and people who love each other enough to keep their mouths shut until the moment's right. You've been doing the hardest part for 2 years without even knowing there was a name for it." She looked at Carol a moment longer than she'd looked at me, something almost like respect passing between two women who'd both learned to keep careful records of things nobody else thought to watch. "From here, though, it has to get more disciplined. Certified lab samples, not hardware store strips. I'll give you a name in Charleston who'll run them, quiet, and won't ask questions you don't want asked. Every photograph, dated and logged the moment it's taken. A written record of every conversation, every truck, every name, kept somewhere nobody but this family can reach it. Sloppy evidence gets thrown out before it ever helps you. Clean evidence is the only kind that survives a courtroom." I asked her before we left the question that had been sitting under my ribs since the morning I read that permit. Whether she thought Lou had simply gotten in over his head, made one bad decision that snowballed past his control the way mine had. Nell looked at me a long moment, the kind of look that doesn't soften what it's about to say out of any kindness. "Your friend didn't fail you, Roy," she said. "He chose you." We drove home from Nell's without talking much, and that night the 4 of us spread everything out across the duplex floor, the way she'd described. A full timeline, every document in order, every connection mapped out on paper so we could see the shape of it whole instead of in pieces. Carol made the coffee. Eli taped papers to the wall with the kind of patience I'd only ever seen him use with things he intended to be very precise about. Wade built the corporate structure into a diagram that looked laid out flat like the root system of something old and deliberately tangled. I sat in the middle of it and tried to think like a man with 40 years of friendship stripped away from the problem, which was harder than anything I could tell you. It was that work, the slow and careful work of laying it all in sequence, that started showing us the thing we hadn't seen when each piece was sitting on its own. The LLC had been filed 17 months before Lou ever came to my porch with that folder of solar panel renderings. The Meridian Partnership, in the version Wade had found, had named a local contact as its West Virginia face 14 months before that morning. Not somebody else's name. A placeholder, a field marked local partner to be confirmed. Confirmed, we could see now, only after I'd said yes. He knew what he was going to need before he ever decided it was going to be you, Carol said, standing over the timeline with her arms crossed. I already knew it by then. But knowing something and watching it spelled out in dates and corporate filing numbers are two different weights. I sat there and I felt the full mass of it for the first time. Not Lou making a bad choice that ran away from him. Not Lou caught in something he didn't know how to back out of. But Lou measuring his options the way a contractor measures a wall before he decides which piece to cut. He'd needed someone for this to work, the way Vance needed it to work. He'd needed a name this county would believe, a man whose signature would carry the right kind of trust, with the bank and the commission and the neighbors. And he'd looked at 40 years of friendship and found exactly what Garrett Vance required. He hadn't stumbled into it. He'd built toward it, the way you'd build toward anything you intended to last. I was the only choice he ever seriously considered. That was the part I kept coming back to. The part that sat in me, different from the rest of it. Not that he'd deceived me, not even that he'd used me, but that he'd looked at everything we'd built together and decided, with what must have been a fairly clear head, that it was a resource, a tool, load-bearing in the way I'd always tried to be, except this time, for something I'd have died before I agreed to carry. Carol sat down next to me on the floor then, and she didn't say anything for a while, and I was grateful for it. She'd kept the recording on her phone, buried in a folder she'd labeled with a grocery list. She played it for me only once, and once was enough. A conversation from 14 months before the LLC filing, Lou's voice unmistakable. The same easy voice I'd heard across 1,000 different tables over a lifetime. Talking to a man whose voice I didn't know, talking about what a good partnership required. The local face has to be genuine, Lou was saying, comfortable as a man ordering coffee. Not somebody who knows what they're signing. Somebody whose signature means something, because he doesn't have any reason to doubt it. I've got that. I'd heard recordings of my own voice on voicemail. Never liked how it sounded. Hearing Lou's voice say that, in that tone, comfortable, professional, the way you'd discuss a piece of equipment you intended to put to good use, was something different. It wasn't the worst thing he'd done to me. Taking the land was worse, and the criminal exposure was worse, and what was happening to the water downstream was worst of all. But there was a kind of precise cruelty in the sound of a man discussing you as an asset that none of those other things carried. And I sat with it a long time before I said a word. Carol's hand was still on top of mine. "What do you want to do?" she asked finally. I thought about everything I'd built in 60 years, and everything I'd let walk out the door without fighting for it. And I thought about Eli standing on that ridge, not saying anything because he didn't have words for what he felt either. And I thought about Otis Beasley's grandchildren drinking well water that tasted like a coin held on the tongue. I thought about a man I'd trusted so completely I'd handed him my signature without reading the words above it, and how that trust had been the most expensive thing I'd ever given anybody. "I'm done being the man who doesn't believe what's right in front of him," I said. "I don't care how long it takes. I don't care what we don't have. We put every piece of this where it can't be ignored, and we don't stop until somebody with the authority to stop them has no choice left but to act." Wade looked up from his diagram. Eli uncapped a fresh marker. Carol just nodded like she'd been waiting for that sentence long before I found my way to it. Nell had given us 3 rules for the surveillance work, and she'd said them once slow, the way a person says something they expect to be repeated back to them years later. Document everything twice. Never go alone. And never let them know you're watching until you have everything you need. We started the following Tuesday after dark, with Wade's camera mounted in a camouflaged housing he'd built himself out of a birdhouse casing and weatherproof foam. The kind of thing you'd barely look at twice if you passed it on a fence post. He'd driven the bench road twice that afternoon, in the guise of a man checking on a trailhead, noting the angles and distances. And he'd placed the housing where it would catch headlights on the access road without being visible from the road itself. He'd planned the whole thing on graph paper the night before. The first thing the camera caught in its third night of recording was a tanker truck with no visible company markings turning up the bench access at 12 minutes past 2 in the morning. Eli ran the plate number through a DMV lookup. Wade had found a legal pathway to access, and the registration came back to a holding company in Kentucky that shared its registered address with 6 other companies. All of them formed in a 12-month window 3 years earlier. We sent the water samples that same week, packed and labeled exactly the way Nell's Charleston contact had specified over the phone. The results came back in 8 days. I won't reproduce the chemical names here because they didn't mean much to me in the moment. But Nell's response when Carol forwarded them to her was a single line. "This is the real thing. Do not talk to anyone local." We didn't. The surveillance fell into a rhythm over the weeks that followed, the kind that has its own particular exhaustion. Not the dramatic kind, but the slow, grinding kind of careful work done in the margins of a life that still had to keep going otherwise. Carol still looked for work. The grocery money was coming from a savings account at a bank 2 counties over that she'd opened in her own name 4 years earlier and never mentioned to me. Eli drove Janelle to her prenatal appointments and ran the bench road in the evenings. Wade slept during the day when he could and monitored the camera feed at night on a laptop that never connected to any network except a VPN he'd set up through a server in another state. I collected what the camera caught and logged it. Time, vehicle description, license plate. Where? Clear enough. Anything moving in or out after dark. 51 nights, by the 7th week, and across them, a pattern that was as orderly as any delivery schedule. Trucks arriving between midnight and 3. Always the same 3 plates, cycling through in rotation. Never the same plate twice in the same week. We also started watching Lou, not the bench road. Lou hadn't been near the bench road since the day his phone went out of service. But he was still in the county, as it turned out, staying in a house on the lake that Carol tracked through a property record filed under a cousin's name. He met with a man at a diner in the next county over on 3 different Fridays, a heavyset man who drove a truck with Virginia plates and who Eli photographed from the diner parking lot through a long lens borrowed from a deer hunter we both knew. Wade ran the plate. The truck was registered to a logistics company that shared a Delaware parent with one of the shells inside Meridian. The heavyset man was Tate Cruz, though we didn't know his name yet. We only knew his face and his truck, and that he came and went from the bench access road more than anyone else in our camera's 51 nights of footage. It was Eli who got too close. He'd gone alone, breaking Nell's second rule, the one about never going without someone else. And he knew it and did it anyway, because he was Eli, and he believed his own judgment about physical risk in a way that 2 combat tours had earned him the right to believe. He'd parked a quarter-mile off and walked a deer trail to get an angle on the access road that would give him plates on the vehicles coming out rather than going in. A gap in our log that had been bothering him for 2 weeks. He was set up in brush above the road camera in hand when headlights swung wide off the access road and held on him for 3 full seconds before the truck stopped. The driver's door opened. A man got out, who was the same shape as the man in the diner photographs. Big through the shoulders, unhurried in the way of a man who spent time in situations that ask for patience. He walked to within 15 feet of where Eli was in the brush and stopped there. "Private property," the man said, his voice carrying easy through the dark, like he had no reason to lower it. "Anybody caught trespassing on active reclamation equipment sites is subject to prosecution." He paused just long enough for the silence to do some work. "You want to have that kind of night? You just stay right there." Eli didn't move, didn't speak. He lay still in the brush and waited until the truck had been gone a full 10 minutes before he stood up and he drove home, without the camera he'd left wedged into a tree fork 30 yards behind him, because going back for it wasn't worth what going back would have cost. He sat down at our kitchen table and told us what had happened, flat and factual, the way he always told things. And when he was done, the room was quiet for a long moment. "He made you," Wade said. "He saw me," Eli said. "He doesn't know who I am yet." The incident with Eli and the man on the bench road changed the rhythm of everything. We pulled the camera, changed our routes, and stopped driving past the bench access entirely for 3 weeks. Nell said that was right. Give it time to go quiet, she told us. Let them think whoever was watching had been scared off. Which, to be plain about it, was not entirely untrue in the case of Wade, who had gone pale as milk when Eli came home and told us what the man had said, and who had needed a day before his hands stopped moving that extra half-inch to check that the duplex's front door was locked every time somebody walked past it on the sidewalk outside. We had by that point more than we'd started with. Water samples with certified results. 51 nights of footage, most of it intact on Wade's backup drives, even if the physical camera was gone. Corporate filings connecting 4 shells back to Meridian. Carol's recording. Eli's photographs of Lou and the heavy-set man at the diner. A county property record showing Lou was still local and still meeting with the same people. What we didn't have was a prosecutor, and we didn't have a timeline. And the land seizure order wasn't going to pause while we built one. It was Carol who found the name. A state environmental compliance officer named Bert Jansen, listed on the DEP website as the regional coordinator for reclamation site inspections in our part of the state. His email was public. His office number was public. And the website noted in small text below his photograph that he had received a governor's certificate of excellence for his work on enforcement actions against unpermitted waste disposal at a site in Mingo County 4 years prior. A man who'd put his name to an enforcement action in Mingo County, Carol reasoned, was a man who had at least once in his professional life done the hard thing, when the hard thing was the right one. I called him on a Tuesday afternoon from a payphone 40 minutes from Hollis Creek, the way Nell had told us to make any calls we didn't want traceable, and he picked up on the second ring. When I told him I had documentation of unpermitted hazardous waste disposal at an active reclamation site in our county, his voice changed in a way that I recognized the shift a person makes when they've been half expecting a call like this and have been wondering when it would come. He asked me to bring in what I had. Not to email it, to bring it in person. He offered a time and gave me a conference room number in a state building 2 hours south. And when I hung up the phone, I sat in that parking lot for a long moment, with something I hadn't felt in weeks filling up the space in my chest that worry usually occupied. I drove down there that Thursday with Carol beside me, and a folder of copies, never the originals. Nell had been clear about that. And Janssen met us in the lobby himself, which I took as a good sign. He was younger than I'd expected, mid-40s, careful eyes behind wire-frame glasses, the kind of neat and calibrated manner that made you think of a man who'd spent his career moving through rooms where every word was on the record. He shook my hand twice, once arriving and once leaving, and between those 2 handshakes, he went through our documentation slowly and asked good questions, the kind that showed he understood what he was looking at. He told us he'd need a week. There were procedures, he said, and protocols for situations like this that he wanted to follow correctly to protect the integrity of the evidence chain. He used that phrase, integrity of the evidence chain. And it made me feel for the first time since the deputy came up our drive, like someone in a position of authority was actually on the right side of the thing. We drove home in a quiet that felt different from the quiet we'd been living in. Not heavy, almost like the air before rain. It was 4 days later, not a week, when Eli called me from the bench road at 7 in the morning, with his voice doing the thing it did when he was working to keep it flat. The access road was empty. The tarps were gone. The drums were gone. The low place in the pit floor had been backfilled so recently the earth was still dark and loose around the edges. Whatever had been parked, stored, or buried on that bench had been moved or covered in a window of roughly 72 hours. That same afternoon, a white pickup I'd never seen before rolled slow past our duplex 3 times in the space of 2 hours. It didn't stop. It didn't park. It just came back around every 40 minutes or so, the way something does when it's making sure you know it's there. I called Nell before I called anyone else. "He flagged you," she said, and her voice carried no surprise at all. "Jansen, I should have checked him better. I'm sorry, Roy." I sat at the kitchen table after I hung up, and I thought about the handshake, the wire-frame glasses, the phrase, integrity of the evidence chain, and the way I'd let myself fill up with something like hope in that parking lot 2 hours south of here. I thought about how good betrayal was at wearing the right face. I thought about Lou. "They know we're not done," Carol said from the doorway. "Good," I said. "I need them nervous." The sound that woke me was something between a knock and something heavier, and it came from the front of the house. At 2:17 in the morning, which I know because I looked at the clock before I got up, and I have not forgotten the time since. Carol was already sitting up. In 41 years, she had never been a sound sleeper, and the weeks we'd been living didn't help. I went to the front window before I went to the door, because Lou had taught me to be careful, if nothing else. And what I saw on the street below was the white pickup parked across from our duplex, with its engine running and its lights off. Not moving. Just sitting there the way it had sat for 2 hours, 3 days before. Except that it was 2:17 in the morning now, and the thing it was sitting outside of was the place where my family slept. I didn't open the door that night. I sat in a kitchen chair with the lights off until the pickup finally rolled away, sometime around 4. And in the morning, I found a scratch down the length of the door beside ours that hadn't been there the day before. And the Pattersons' dog, who barked at everything, hadn't made a sound all night. Wade had been quietly tracking Marcus Bell, who ran the Hollis Creek Courier out of a Main Street storefront, 11 years of weekly paper that served, Nell said, as the closest thing we had to local public accountability. Wade had reached out to him quietly a month prior. Nothing specific, just a sense that Marcus might be working a story that paralleled what we knew. And Marcus had been cautious, but not unfriendly. That changed the week after we went to see Jansen. Marcus stopped returning Wade's messages. When Wade drove by, the storefront was dark. A handwritten note taped to the glass. Closed for renovation. No date. "Somebody leaned on him," Wade said. And I didn't have a reason to think he was wrong. Nell spent a week pulling everything she could find on Bert Jansen, and what she found was not complicated once you knew to look for it. His ex-wife's brother ran a grading company that had received 2 no-bid contracts from Blue Mountain in its first 6 months. The governor's certificate of excellence, it turned out, had been recommended by the same county commission that Lou had sat on for 8 years. The enforcement action in Mingo County had quietly been overturned on procedural grounds 18 months after it was filed, and the company involved had resumed operations under a new name. The whole thing was a wall, built out of the same material as the permit Lou had pressed into my hands. Paper that looked load-bearing until you put weight on it. What finally moved me past the point of caution wasn't the pickup, or Marcus Bell's dark storefront, or even Jansen. It was a Tuesday afternoon, ordinary in every visible way, when Eli picked Lily up from kindergarten and stopped for gas on the way home, and left her buckled in the back seat for the 2 minutes it took to run his card. When he got back to the truck, Tate Cruz was crouched beside the passenger window, talking to her through the glass. Not touching the door, not opening it. Just talking to a 5-year-old girl through a car window in a gas station parking lot, unhurried the way a man does something he wants to be seen doing, without it being something he can be arrested for. Eli was out of the truck before the door had fully closed behind him. Tate straightened up, nodded once like a man who'd said what he came to say, and walked back to the white pickup without another word. Lily told Eli the man had asked if she knew what her daddy did at night sometimes. I sat in the kitchen that evening after the boys had gone home, and I thought about that question for a long time. Then I thought about Janelle's prenatal appointment 2 weeks out, and the way Eli hadn't come home the same since he'd seen what was on that bench. And Otis Beasley's grandchildren, and what it meant to live in a county where the men who were supposed to keep records of wrongdoing were keeping different records instead. I thought about what Nell had said the first day we sat at her kitchen table, that our only real shot was bypassing every local office that might tip our hand. I'd tried the half measure. I'd tried the door that looked like the right one. The results were parked outside our house with its lights off at 2 a.m, and were crouching beside my granddaughter's window on a Tuesday afternoon. I found the number I'd written on the inside cover of a notebook I kept separate from everything else. The number Nell had given me 6 weeks earlier and told me to use when we had enough. I dialed it from a gas station 40 minutes east, a different one each time, and when a woman's voice answered and identified the FBI field office in Charleston, I asked for the agent whose name Nell had given me. I told her I had certified environmental lab results, 50 nights of time-stamped surveillance footage, a chain of 4 corporate shells connecting to the same source, a recording of the man who'd set it up, discussing his plan before it was executed, and a state compliance officer who'd taken our documentation and relayed it to the people we were building a case against. There was a pause. "Mr. Hatfield," she said, "I'm going to need you to meet with me." "I'll meet you anywhere you want," I said. "But I want you to understand something first. I'm done doing this the way that lets them stay one step ahead of us. Whatever comes next, we do it the hard way. And we don't stop." Agent Maria Delgado drove up in an unmarked car on a Thursday morning and sat at our kitchen table like a woman who'd been in a lot of kitchens. Mid-40s, economical in the way she moved, the kind of careful that isn't cold, but that doesn't spend itself on things that don't require it. She'd brought nothing with her except a small recorder she set on the table between us and asked permission to use, and she drank the coffee Carol gave her without commenting on it in either direction. She'd spoken to Nell before she came. That, she said, was why she was here in person, rather than routing this through the standard intake process. And I understood from the way she said it that Nell's name carried weight in federal circles that it didn't carry anymore in county ones. She went through our documentation for 2 hours. Not quickly, not in the skimming way that Jansen had gone through it, but with the attention of someone who was building something in her head as she read, and asking questions when a seam didn't line up. She knew what she was looking at before she asked about it. That mattered to me. "You have enough for me to open an investigation," she said when she'd looked at everything. "The lab results alone are a federal environmental crime, and the shell company structure has the fingerprints of something we've been watching at the interstate level for a while. But what you don't have, and what I need to take this to prosecution rather than settlement, is proof of intent established before your involvement." "The recording," I said. "Lou talking to Vance about needing a genuine local face. That proves intent to deceive you," she said. "That's not the same as proving the waste disposal was planned before your signature was ever obtained. For that, I need a document, a communication, a contract, an internal memo that shows Meridian and Mr. Brandt agreed to the disposal operation before Blue Mountain was ever presented to you as a legitimate reclamation project. Something that predates your signature by a meaningful margin. Wade looked at me across the table. We both knew what she was describing existed. We'd been building toward it for months without finding it, and the reason we hadn't found it was that it was almost certainly in one of two places. Vance's site office in the compound above our bench road, or whatever Lou was keeping in the lake house Carol had tracked through the property record. It was after Delgado left, in the late afternoon quiet that followed, that Marcus Bell knocked on our door. He looked like a man who'd been sleeping badly for a month, which I suspected was accurate. He'd gone dark after Jansen, he told us. Not because he'd been frightened off, but because somebody had come by his apartment and broken a window at 3 in the morning. And he'd decided that going quiet for a few weeks was smarter than going loud before he had something worth going loud with. He'd spent those weeks pulling property records, corporate registrations, and a paper trail that paralleled ours in places and diverged in others. And what he'd found that we hadn't was a deed transfer Vance's construction equipment company, operating through one of the Delaware shells, had transferred title to the Bench Road access parcel from a holding company to Meridian Resource Partners, 11 months before Lou first came to my porch. 11 months before. The site had been selected and legally prepared for Meridian's use, before any of us had ever heard the words Blue Mountain Renewable Partners. "I can publish this tomorrow," Marcus said. "Hollis Creek Courier has a website that still runs even if the storefront's closed. But I wanted you to know first." Wade was already calling Delgado before Marcus had finished his sentence. The piece we were missing and the piece Marcus had found were different edges of the same thing. Together, they could establish that the entire Blue Mountain project had been conceived as a cover for an already operational waste disposal site, with Roy Hatfield's name and credibility obtained specifically to give it local legitimacy. That was intent. That was what a federal prosecutor needed. What it required was getting those two pieces into the same room before they disappeared. Delgado called back within the hour. She'd pulled Meridian's corporate filings, cross-referenced with customs and commercial travel databases, and Garrett Vance had booked a flight out of Pittsburgh to Cancun on Saturday morning with a one-way ticket. "He's running," she said, and her voice had the tone of someone who'd seen this before too. "How long do we have?" I asked. "If we're going to get anything out of the site office before he has someone clean it Friday night, we need it in hand before Friday noon. After that, whatever's on that property is likely to be gone by the time I can get a warrant executed through proper channels." She paused. "I'm not asking you to do anything, Mr. Hatfield. I want to be clear about that." "You're not asking," I said. "I'm not asking," she said again. I looked at Carol, who was leaning against the counter with her arms folded, looking back at me with the same expression she'd had that first night she pulled the lockbox from under the floorboard. Patient and certain, like she'd already run the calculation and was just waiting for me to finish mine. "Then you don't need to," I said. "Whatever is in that office, I know that land better than any man alive, and I have 2 sons who know it almost as well." The call ended. Wade was already pulling up the satellite image of the bench road on his laptop, tracing the deer trail above the access road the way Eli had walked it in October, measuring the distance from the road to the site office in his head. "Thursday night," Eli said quietly, "before they know we're coming." We went in at 2 in the morning, which was the window Eli had calculated gave us the longest dark before the crew that had been spotted arriving at the compound at 5:30 most mornings. 3 of us, me, Eli, and Wade. Because we'd argued about it, and nobody could make a case for leaving one of us home that the other 2 couldn't knock down. Nell stayed by her phone 30 miles south, a relay point if something went wrong that we needed to get a message through without touching our own numbers. I knew that ridge in the dark the way I knew the layout of my own shop. Every root, every loose stone, the place where the deer trail dips down toward the hollow, and comes back up along the old property line. My grandfather had hand-staked in 1941. We came out above the compound from the north face, not the access road, moving the way Eli had taught us to move without speaking, slow, weight back on the heel. First, stop and listen. Every 20 yards. The side office was a prefabricated metal building set back from the road behind a chain-link fence that had been padlocked with a combination lock, not a keyed one, which Wade said he'd already read as a shortcut from a man who wasn't planning to be here long. He had it open in 4 minutes with a tool he'd ordered online, without mentioning until we were in the truck. The office had one window and a door that opened on a barrel bolt. No deadlock, which confirmed what the combination lock had suggested. Vance was already halfway gone in his own mind. Wade pulled the door, and we went in. The filing cabinet was unlocked. The top drawer held routing slips and fuel receipts and nothing that mattered. The second drawer held a brown accordion folder, the kind with the elastic closure and the alphabet tabs. And behind the tab labeled M was a contract, 31 pages, dated 14 months before the Blue Mountain LLC filing. 14 months before Lou came to my porch with a folder full of solar panel drawings. Garrett Vance is principal of Meridian Resource Partners, contracting with one Louis D. Brandt for the exclusive facilitation of local permitting, community relations, and the procurement of a qualifying local resident managing member for a West Virginia reclamation and resource recovery operation. Payment schedule attached. Facilitation fee, $300,000, payable in 3 installments, the third and largest contingent on successful execution of the managing member agreement. $300,000. I stood in that metal building with a flashlight in one hand and 31 pages in the other, and I read those words twice more. And I want to tell you I was surprised, but I was not. What I was finished with the last small part of me that had still been trying to find an explanation that let Lou be something other than what he was. 40 years of friendship had a price. It had been negotiated, documented, and signed with a notary stamp, and the number was $300,000. Wade photographed every page. I folded the original into the inside pocket of my jacket, next to my chest, which was where it stayed. We were 4 minutes from the door when Eli put a hand on my arm. Headlights. Coming up the access road, not at the 5:30 pace of the work crew, but faster. The way somebody drives when they've been told to hurry. Wade killed his flashlight. We stood in the dark of that office and listened to a truck door close, and then boots on gravel moving toward the office, not toward the equipment shed, the way the crew always moved. I thought about the combination lock we'd left hanging open on the fence gate. The boots stopped just outside the door. "Roy," Lou's voice from the other side of a metal wall in the dark. Quieter than I'd expected it to sound, and tired in a way I hadn't heard from him in all the years I'd known him. "Roy, I know you're in there. I can see Wade's car down the road." I looked at my sons in the dark. Eli's jaw was set. Wade had his phone in his hand, already recording. "I'm not here to stop you," Lou said. "I want you to know that. I'm not armed. I'm not calling Tate. I'm just..." A pause. "I need you to know I didn't think it would go this far. I didn't think they'd come after your family." The silence after that was its own kind of answer. "You can keep what you found in there," he said. "I'm not going to stop you taking it. I needed you to know that." Eli moved past me and opened the door. Lou was standing alone on the gravel. No truck visible behind him. His hands open at his sides, the way a man stands when he's trying to look like he's given something up. He looked smaller than I remembered him looking. That, more than anything, was what I carried out of that compound into the dark. Not the contract, not the $300,000 with his name on it, but the way Lou Brandt looked, standing alone in the gravel at 2 in the morning. A man who'd traded 40 years for a number, and had only just started to understand what that trade had actually cost him. I didn't say a word to him. Neither did my sons. We walked back up the ridge the same way we'd come down it, and we were in the truck and off the county road before any of us spoke. "We have it," Wade said. "We have it," I said. I kept my hand flat on my chest the whole drive home, feeling the fold of those 31 pages through my jacket. And I didn't feel triumphant. I felt like a man carrying something that had needed to be brought to light for a long time, and who was glad to finally be the one carrying it. We were at Delgado's field office in Charleston by 6 in the morning, with the original contract in a manila envelope and Wade's photographs on a drive. And she had a prosecutor on the phone before we'd finished our coffee. The warrant for the site compound was filed by 9. Marcus Bell had sent his article to the Hollis Creek Courier's website and to 3 regional outlets the night before, timed to publish at 7, which meant that by the time Roy E. Hatfield was sitting in a federal building, watching a federal agent make federal phone calls, the county commission was reading the story on their phones in the parking lot before their 9:30 meeting. I learned later what happened at that meeting from 3 different people who were there, and all 3 told it roughly the same way, which is how I know it's true. The chairman called the meeting to order at 9:40, 15 minutes late because half the room was still on their phones. Lou Brandt's seat at the end of the commission table was empty. It had been empty since a deputy had met him in his driveway at 8:55 that morning with a federal material witness order and a plain-clothed FBI agent who'd driven up from Charleston the evening before. The 2 remaining commissioners who hadn't known about Blue Mountain before Marcus's article in Delgado believed, and I believed her, that there were 2 who hadn't sat in their chairs looking at each other with the faces of men who'd been standing next to a wall for 8 years without knowing what was behind it. Marcus had written it clean and plain, the way a man writes something he's been holding on to for a long time and doesn't want to complicate with anything extra. The deed transfer, the LLC filing date versus the date Lou had first approached me, the facilitation fee, the shell companies, the water test results, the names of the families downstream of Cold Hollow Creek whose wells had been affected, starting with Otis Beasley. He'd withheld the specific details of the federal operation as Delgado had asked, but he'd printed everything else, and everything else was enough. Delgado called us just after 11. The compound had been secured. EPA Criminal Division was on the site with their own teams. Tate Cruz had been taken into custody at the state line. The white pickup he'd been driving all those weeks pulled over by a state trooper acting on a federal tip before he'd gotten 20 miles from Hollis Creek. Garrett Vance had not been at the compound. By noon, the departure board at Pittsburgh International was showing his 10:50 flight to Cancun as departed on time, and the federal hold that should have been placed on his travel documents had gone to the wrong desk at the TSA the night before. The kind of mistake that happens when something is moving fast and there are too many hands on it. And Vance had walked through the gate before anyone caught it. There was a window of perhaps 6 hours before he could be pulled off a connecting flight in Dallas. We were driving back up the mountain by 12:30 through Hollis Creek's Main Street for the first time since the months when I'd been avoiding it. And I want to tell you the town looked the same as it always had, because mostly it did. The post office, the hardware store where Lou's office had been dark since October, the gas station where Carl Anders had stopped me by the pumps, half out of his mind, asking about his $11,000. Carl was standing outside it now in the cold, and when he saw my truck, he raised one hand. Not a wave exactly, something between a wave and an acknowledgement, the kind of gesture a man makes when he doesn't have words yet for what he wants to say, but doesn't want to say nothing. I lifted 2 fingers off the steering wheel back at him. That was the whole exchange, and it was enough. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes after a long time of being thought to be something you aren't. Not the exhaustion of fighting it, but the exhaustion of carrying it. The weight of knowing every room you walk into has already decided something about you that isn't true. I had been carrying that weight for almost a year. I didn't feel it lift all at once. I felt it shift, which was different, but was something. Carol had her phone in her hand when I walked into the duplex, and she told me Marcus's article had been shared from the Courier's website more than 400 times in 4 hours, which was more than the Courier had been shared in the previous 4 years combined. She told me Mrs. Kessler had left a voicemail. She told me Otis Beasley had driven by and left a pie on the porch, which was a thing Otis had apparently never done for anyone in his life. I sat down on the couch in that rental duplex that wasn't my house and wasn't my land, and I let myself feel what there was to feel. And what there was to feel was complicated and large and not entirely happy. Because a year of what we'd been through doesn't resolve into happiness. It resolves into something quieter and harder to name, something that has relief in it, but also the weight of everything it took to get there. Delgado called again at 4 in the afternoon. "The Dallas field office has him," she said. "Mr. Hatfield, it's done." I was still sitting on that couch when Eli called 20 minutes later, his voice coming in wrong before I understood what he was saying. He was on the county road north of town. He'd seen Lou's truck pulled onto the shoulder. Lou was still in it, alone. "He's just sitting there, Dad," Eli said. "He's not going anywhere." Lou's truck was pulled onto the gravel shoulder of Route 41, just past the Lick Run Bridge, with the engine off and the hazard lights blinking, the way they blink when somebody's stopped and doesn't plan to move on their own. I saw it when I came around the curve, and I pulled in behind it the way you'd pull in behind somebody who'd broken down, because some part of me had not yet learned a different way to approach Lou Brandt than the way a man approaches a friend. He was sitting in the driver's seat, with his hands on his thighs, not on the wheel. The overhead cab light was on. He looked up when I knocked on the passenger window, and then he reached over and unlocked the door. I got in. We sat in that truck for a long moment without saying anything. The hazard lights clicking, the sound of Lick Run moving over its stones below the bridge. Lou had aged in ways I hadn't tracked from a distance. There were things in his face that hadn't been there the last time I'd sat next to him, in any kind of light. "I called them myself," he said finally. "Delgado. Told her where I was. I didn't want you to have to look for me." I didn't say anything to that. "I'm not going to ask you to understand it," he said. "I know what I did. I knew what I was doing when I did it. That's the part I couldn't sleep past, if I'm honest. Not that it fell apart, not that you found out. That I did it knowing exactly what it was, and I went ahead anyway." "Why?" I said. Not as an accusation, just the actual question. He was quiet long enough that I thought maybe he wasn't going to answer. And then he said, "The money was real. Vance was real. And I told myself," he stopped. "I told myself you'd be fine. That your name would be on paper for a couple of years, and then the project would finish, and the paper would be filed away, and nobody would ever look at it. I told myself it wasn't the same as hurting you if it never came apart." "It came apart," I said. "It came apart," he said. I looked out the windshield at the county road I'd driven 10,000 times in my life, and I thought about 9-year-old boys throwing rocks at a creek, and 40 years of handshakes, and the day he'd carried my father's casket, and the morning he'd come up my gravel with a folder full of drawings that looked like the future of something. I thought about $300,000 in a document signed with a notary stamp, and I thought about Lily sitting in the back seat of Eli's truck while a man she didn't know crouched at her window. I thought about Carol's folder of copies tucked behind the recipe box for 2 years, and what it said about who'd actually been looking out for me all along. "I trusted you," I said, "for 40 years. I would have given you anything you asked me for straight out. You knew that." "I know," Lou said. "And that's what you used," I said. He didn't answer that, because there wasn't an answer that helped anything. We heard the car before we saw it. Delgado's field supervisor, the one who'd coordinated the material witness order that morning. coming around the curve with a second vehicle behind him. Lou reached down and clicked the hazard lights off, and the truck went quiet. Except for the creak. "Roy," he said when the car lights were close enough to be real. "I'm sorry. I know it doesn't do anything for you. I know it doesn't give back anything I took. But I need you to know, I'm sorry." I got out of the truck. I stood in the cold on the shoulder of Route 41 and watched two federal agents walk up to the driver's side of Lou Brandt's truck. And I watched them speak to him through the window. And I watched him nod and open the door and step out and put his hands behind his back with the same unhurried quiet of a man who'd already decided to be done fighting. I watched them put him in the back of the second vehicle. I watched the car drive away. There was nothing triumphant in it. I want you to understand that. I had wanted the truth to come out. I had wanted the land back and my name cleared and the families downstream of Cold Hollow Creek made whole. None of those things had happened yet, and only some of them were going to happen because of anything that had happened today. My phone rang. A number I didn't recognize, 804 area code. And when I answered it, the voice on the other end identified itself as Sam Whitlow, environmental attorney calling at the request of Nell Voss. "I've been watching the Meridian situation for a few months," he said. "I think we need to talk about your land." "I'm listening," I said. "The criminal charges that were filed today are a separate matter from the civil lien on your property," he said in the way of a man who wanted to be clear before anything else. "The seizure and the foreclosure were processed through a state court. A federal criminal conviction doesn't automatically reverse a state civil judgment. You need someone to go after the land separately through a different channel, and you need to move before the foreclosure finalization date." The creek ran below the bridge in the dark, patient and indifferent, the way water runs whether it's clean or not. "When can you be here?" I asked. Sam Whitlow arrived at our duplex at 8 the next morning with 2 legal pads, a briefcase that had seen better decades, and the manner of a man who ate opposing counsel for breakfast and found it barely filling. He spread 3 pages on the kitchen table and walked us through the theory of the case in 20 minutes flat, which was how I understood he'd done this before, many times, and knew which parts mattered and which parts a family at a kitchen table didn't need to carry. The civil claim rested on a single argument. The managing member designation that had created the lien on our property was itself fraudulent, because Roy Hatfield had never been an actual managing member, with any real authority, decision-making power, or knowledge of the company's actual operations. He had been designated as a paper principal, specifically to provide legal cover for activities he'd never been informed of. A contract obtained through material fraud and deliberate misrepresentation could not serve as the basis for a valid security interest in our land. The lien in Whitlow's construction was not merely wrongful, it was void from inception. "The federal case gives us the misrepresentation," he said. "The contract from the site office gives us the conspiracy to designate you fraudulently. The question is whether we can get a judge to move faster than the foreclosure clock." The foreclosure finalization was 12 days out. Whitlow had already filed for an emergency hearing. He had a date 4 days later. The thing that moved me in those 4 days was not anything we did ourselves. It was the county. Carl Anders came by the duplex with a signed affidavit describing what Lou had told him when he'd persuaded Carl to invest. Language that Carl noted was almost identical to what Lou had told me. 2 women from the church, whose retirement accounts had been rolled into Blue Mountain at Lou's recommendation, brought their own statements, written out longhand on notebook paper, to Whitlow's temporary office above the pharmacy. Otis Beasley drove in from his farm and sat in a plastic chair for 2 hours, waiting to sign whatever Whitlow needed him to sign. And when he finally left, he stopped at the door and told me he'd been watering his cattle downstream from our land for 30 years, and he'd be damned if he was going to let a man from Delaware poison it and walk free. I don't know how many people came through that office in 4 days. I know it was more than I expected, and more than I deserved. And I know that the pile of paper they left behind was more than Whitlow had anticipated building when he first called from the 804 area code. The hearing was in a state courthouse 2 counties over, before Judge Eleanor Hardesty, who had the reputation Whitlow told us in the parking lot of having no patience for what she called paper arrangements. We sat at the plaintiff's table, me, Whitlow, Carol, and across from us sat the bank's attorney, and a man from the state who'd been assigned to represent the foreclosure process. They were professionals doing a professional job, and they were going to lose. And I think they knew it before the hearing started. Whitlow presented the theory of the case in 30 minutes. He entered the federal criminal complaint, the site office contract, the timeline establishing that the LLC had been filed before any contact with Roy Hatfield, and Carol's recording of Lou discussing the need for a genuine local face who didn't know what he was signing. He called me to testify, and I told the truth, the same way I'd always told it, without embellishment and without apology. And when the bank's attorney asked me on cross-examination whether I had signed the documents voluntarily, I told him yes, and that I had signed them in full trust of a man I'd known for 40 years, who had been paid $300,000 to make sure that trust was in the right place for him to use it. Judge Hardesty was quiet for a long moment after the bank's attorney finished his response. And in that quiet, I could hear Carol's breathing beside me, and the click of a pen somewhere behind us, and the sound of the ventilation system in an old courthouse doing its best. "The court finds," she said in a voice that didn't need any additional weight, because it already carried all of it, that the security interest underlying the foreclosure proceeding was obtained through a documented pattern of fraudulent misrepresentation, and that the plaintiff's designation as managing member of Blue Mountain Renewable Partners LLC was a manufactured status designed to externalize criminal liability. The lien is vacated. The foreclosure is dismissed. The property reverts to its prior ownership immediately. Carol's hand found mine under the table. I had spent 60 years building things designed to hold weight. I had never until that moment understood what it felt like to be the thing being held up. The courtroom was quiet around us, and Whitlow was already moving papers, and the bank's attorney was speaking to someone on his phone. And none of it touched me, because all I could feel was Carol's hand and the specific quality of the silence that follows the end of something long and heavy. We drove home through the county in the late afternoon, the ridge visible from the highway in the low winter light, and I didn't look away from it until we'd passed the county line. The land didn't know I was coming back. Land doesn't wait for anything. It just stands there doing what it's always done, the same as it was doing the morning my great-grandfather first put a mule against it and started clearing. That was all right. I had waited long enough for both of us. We drove up the gravel on a Saturday in early December, the 4 of us, me and Carol, in my truck, Eli and Wade behind us. And when the house came around the last curve and the ridge rose up above it against the gray winter sky, Carol put her hand on my arm and didn't say anything. And I was grateful for that, because there wasn't a word in English that would have been better than the silence she gave me instead. The house had sat empty for the better part of a year. A window sash had warped from condensation, a section of gutter had pulled loose, and the front porch needed painting, the way it always had needed painting. The land didn't look like it had noticed we were gone. The ridge stood the way it always stood, cold and gray-green under a sky thinking about snow, indifferent to everything that had happened in the valley below it. We didn't go inside right away. We walked down to Cold Hollow Creek first, all 4 of us standing on the bank, the same way we'd stood in the hallway of the duplex on that first night, with everything spread out around us on the floor, together, without needing to announce it. The water ran clear, not the rust-colored sheen of a year ago, not the penny taste Otis Beasley's grandchildren had been living with. The EPA remediation team had finished 3 weeks before. The state had certified the site clean the week after, and the creek looked the way it had always looked. Cold, clear, running over its stones toward the hollow, the way it had been running since before any Hatfield set foot in this county. Otis Beasley came the following weekend with 2 of his sons and a loader, and together we spent 2 days pulling the fence that Meridian's crew had run across the Bench Road access, chain-linking it off like it was theirs to close. Carl Anders showed up on the second day with 3 other men from town, and nobody asked him to. They just came, the way people in a county like this come to things that need doing, because some obligations don't require an invitation. Marcus Bell ran a piece in the Courier that winter about proposed legislation in Charleston. A bill that would require personal disclosure of beneficial interests in any reclamation project, preventing the kind of paper principal arrangement that had been done to us from being done legally to anyone else in West Virginia. I don't know how far that bill went. I know it was introduced, and I know Marcus wrote about it the same way he wrote everything, clean and plain. The thing Carol told me, I want to be honest, came out by accident. It was an evening in late January, after the boys had gone home, and we were sitting at the kitchen table, in our own kitchen, in our own house, with the wood stove doing what it was built to do, and she was going through a folder of property paperwork, because Carol's way of being home was always to know exactly where all the paper was. She pulled out a document I hadn't seen before, and she started to explain it, and then she stopped and said, "I was going to tell you after things settled down." I kept putting it off. What she'd done was 7 years ago, quietly, without mentioning it to me, the way she did certain things she understood better than I did. She'd separated the original summit acreage, the 12 acres at the top of the ridge, the oldest piece of the whole property, into a small, revocable land trust in her own name. An attorney, 2 counties over, a recording done on a Tuesday, she'd told me was a dentist appointment. A document filed so quietly in the county records that nobody scanning for the Hatfield name would have found it. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Because you would have asked why," she said. "And I didn't have a reason you would have accepted at the time. I just had a feeling about Lou that I couldn't explain yet." The summit acreage had never been part of the lien. It had never been at risk. The oldest piece of our family's land, the place where my great-grandfather had put a mule against the stone and made something out of nothing, had belonged to Carol alone for 7 years, waiting quietly in a county record under a name nobody was looking for. Untouchable. The foundation had never broken. I'd just been standing in a part of the house that was built on something else. There is a particular piece of the ridge, just below the summit, where the ground levels off before the final climb, and you can see the whole hollow beneath you. Our roof, Cold Hollow Creek, the fields, Otis Beasley's pasture in the middle distance, the church steeple in town beyond that. I had stood in that spot 1,000 times. On an afternoon in March, almost exactly a year after the whole of this had started, I stood there again, with Lily beside me. Her small hand wrapped around 2 of my fingers, looking out at everything below us like a person who was seeing it for the first time. Because every time was the first time. When you were 5 years old and the world was still the size of what you could see from a ridge. "What's that?" she said, pointing at the creek. "Cold Hollow," I told her. "Your great-great-grandfather built a stone wall along that bank before your great-grandfather was born. And your granddaddy pulled stone off this same ridge for 30 years. And someday, if you want to, you'll know every inch of it the same way we all did." She nodded like that was reasonable and went back to looking. That's where I'll leave it for now. On a ridge in West Virginia, in the early March light, with a 5-year-old who has her whole life to learn the difference between what's load-bearing and what just looks that way. If you have ever been made to feel like a fool for believing in someone, I want you to hear this from a man who has been exactly there. Being betrayed by someone you trusted does not mean your trust was foolish. It means someone chose to be unworthy of something good in you. That is on them, not on you. And more often than you would think, the people who truly love you have already been quietly watching your back long before you ever knew you needed them to.